interest in non-professional acting. It's not a new topic, but I think it's a growing topic. It's a topic that is rich and seminal to the study of independent cinema and has been overlooked, I think, for too long in film studies. And once you open the lid on questions of non-professional film performance, it's just opened so many questions about uh, labor, performance aesthetics, and constructions of realism, collaboration, and so on and so forth. So it's a very generative topic. So the two books that we're launching today by Miguel Gagiotti and Catherine O'Rawe, for me, they really lay the foundations for future study of non-professional film performance. Gaggiotti's book is first and foremost a work of criticism, I would say, film criticism, while O'Rawe's is perhaps more on the historical side. And they're both very strong books, and they're amazingly complementary to each other with very little overlap. Despite the fact that they both have a image from Bicycle Thieves on the cover, kind of deceptive. Miguel's book came out in 2023 from Palgrave, and O'Rawe's book came out in 2024 from Bloomsbury Academic. So it's a little bit of a belated book launch. Better late than never, and maybe some of you may have already read the books, which will make our question period all the more rich. I hope. Um, I'm going to start us off by kind of providing a brief summary of the two books, and then I'll pose a couple of questions to the authors, and then turn it over to you guys for your questions. So, Catherine O'Rawe, first of all, is a professor of Italian film and culture at the University of Bristol in the UK. And her book is called The Non-Professional Actor, Italian Neorealist Cinema and Beyond. Here it is. I there's the Bicycle Thieves. I don't have a copy of Miguel's book as I read it online. I'm sorry about that. Um, so it focuses on Italian cinema, and as the title suggests, and fills in some of the prehistory of non-professionals and pre-war Italian cinema before going into detailed discussions of many key neorealist titles featuring untrained men, women, and children, and situating them really within the film culture of the period of post-war Italy. Um, and she has many detailed discussions of some key titles in neorealism, featuring untrained men, women, and children. Her research hones in on questions of ethics, casting, and reception, and she really fills in the historical context, including often asking the question, "Where are they now?" Meaning, like, what happened to these people after the filmmakers went home? And it's not always a pretty picture. And her work on women and child actors is particularly illuminating in this respect. And in her final chapter, she considers how the practice has evolved in global art house cinema, where it's become a very familiar tactic of realist aesthetics. Her meticulous research poses critical ethical questions, while her detailed analyses zero in on overlooked details of many seminal performances and contributions that so many forgotten people have made to world cinema. Moving on to Miguel Gaggiotti's, he is a filmmaker and senior lecturer in film and television at the University of Bristol. And his book, A Non-Professional Film Performance, has a much broader framework than O'Rawe's book, and includes a history of the practice of casting untrained performers from the Lumiere brothers. It really provides quite an overview from the Lumiere brothers to contemporary directors such as Joanna Hogg and Albert Serra. His chapters on Italian cinema include some very thoughtful analyses of Pasolini, as well as canonical films such as Germany Year Zero and Paisan. And his chapters on the Soviet directors, Kuleshov, Eisenstein, and Budovkin, fill in valuable studies of their theoretical positions on acting, which he plays off really smartly, I think, with the performances in some key films by those directors. And his emphasis is on close analysis and the work of the performers themselves in a wide array of cinema, looking at the way that these performances have an aesthetic valence all of their own. And he examines them reflexively, noting how notes of hesitancy, insecurity, sometimes challenge the narratives, but are at the same time, I think, exploited and used by various directors who I mean they kind of, it's the effect of the non-perform professional performance style, which is kind of a style without a style. Anyway, that's brief summaries of the two books. They both have really great bibliographies and they bring together a vast array of writing. Um, and I see some of the authors on the board today whose work has provided the foundations for their foundations. And certainly, once you look at those by bibliographies, you realize it's not that neglected a topic. It's just it's like really, but it's really important that they've been brought together in these two books. Um, and that's one of the reasons why I find them so useful as kind of foundational texts. Um, so both Miguel and Catherine teach at the University of Bristol, which now I imagine to be kind of a hotbed of thinking about non-professional acting. Although I have spoken to them, and I think it was more than more of a coincidence than anything else. But my first question to the authors is that given your two very different approaches to this topic, maybe you could talk a little bit, first of all, how you came to it, and what you learned from the other person's book. So you could kind of build on my uh, summary. So I don't know, Catherine, do you want to go first?
Okay, yeah, sure. Can you hear me all right?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, so I came to, and I had started working on it already, and then I met Miguel. So it was a coincidence, but it was a kind of happy one that we were able to kind of dialogue a lot, especially as we were both kind of writing the books. Yeah, I came to it because really there was this sense of the kind of absence, though, as you say, I mean, it's not quite an absence in that there has been quite a lot of scattered attention to the non-professional over the years, like in Italy, right from the 30s onwards, right? There've been a lot of debates on this, but it's never been kind of put together. And the kind of obsession with neorealism in the Italian critical context was something that had always kind of bothered me. But the fact that so many things were also at the same time being kind of neglected, right? So there's like 2 million books on neorealism, but nobody had really kind of addressed the question of the non-professional. It was always kind of in the margins, a tangent, a footnote. So as I was working, that became my focus. It was originally going to be a broader book about kind of performance and stardom more generally in that period. So that was kind of, it became a bit of, yeah, a focus, a kind of obsession. And also while I was writing it or kind of starting to write it, which was around like 2017, 18, 'cause it took me a very long time, there were quite a few like prominent contemporary sort of art house prestige films that were coming out and getting a lot of attention for the use of non-professionals. So we had like Cuarón's Roma winning the Oscar, Nomadland, 2020, even Clint Eastwood's 1517 to Paris, right, which was kind of a very different type of film. So I was kind of always thinking at the same time, oh, actually, there's still, this still has an enduring kind of fascination. Some of these questions that I was examining in the 40s and the debates on them in Italy kind of we're still really resonating today, and questions about what does the non-professional bring, how do they get recompensed, what happens to them after, um their kind of value to the kind of prestige economy of like global cinema seem to be kind of just still a bit like unresolved, really, you know? So that was kind of helpful to me in kind of thinking, okay, it's not just like a historical piece of work that I'm doing, but I'm, you know, trying to kind of think about and resolve something that's still really ongoing because, you know, there still haven't been that much attention to non-professionals in the contemporary context, which is why then I added the final chapter. And I was kind of, as you said, I was maybe taking this more historical approach in the Italian context, trying to excavate some of these stories of performers who had perhaps been celebrated but then disappear, or trying to disentangle some of the mythologies around them. And that kind of felt like, you know, it was something I really wanted to do. And then I think the difference really with Miguel's work is that I am kind of more historical and biographically kind of focused, and he is more like text focused. So that was kind of complementary. And it's not that I don't pay any attention to performance because I really tried to do so, though at times I did feel a bit like I was kind of doing film studies without the films because I got more and more interested in the kind of people, you know. Um, but you know, I was always kind of trying to bring it back to, okay, what are they doing on screen? You know, how can we analyze that? But I think, you know, the value, part of the value of Miguel's book is this really intense attention to performance and gesture, the kind of modalities of that, the value of that, the kind of accidental contingent gesture and kind of how we read out of that. And the kind of ambiguity of that, and you mentioned, you know, him was talking about the non-professional effect, you know, and kind of where that comes from. But also, I think some of his thoughts on, because I mean, I've been very interested in this question of non-professionals as kind of workers in the film industry because they were so exposed often, right, in that way. And what has been interesting is Miguel has had quite a lot of focus in his book on work, but kind of work within the film as well. So like films where we get people repeating the kind of gestures of work that they would do outside the film in the film. And I think that kind of adds a new perspective on this question of kind of labor and the kind of repetitive nature of that we see in some of these films, as well as yeah, because he talks about this kind of co-creation of some of these films, you know, drawing on the labor of the performer. I think I've tended sometimes to be a bit more apocalyptic and being a bit more like this is a kind of very extractive process because a lot of the case studies I came across kind of felt like that. But I think, you know, maybe his approach is more kind of balanced in that way.
Great. Thank you so much. Miguel?
Thank you. Yeah, so in my case, I came to the topic. I think I've started having an interest in the topic when I was doing my undergrad in film. So, the book is, developed from my PhD thesis. And when I was doing my undergraduate, which was in this sort of early mid 2000s, so I was coming from Argentina to the UK to study film. And it was a period in which, in Argentine cinema, there was this boom of, sort of independent cinema, kind of slow cinema with a lot of films made with non-professional actors. In the UK, there were also films being made like This Is England and Fish Tank and the Andrew Arnold films, Lynn Ramsey, Sweet 16, Ken Loach. And it was kind of like a topic that I had in common with my friends. Like everybody who was into the kind of independent cinema was watching those kind of films. And then I also got to take some really interesting courses that were on neorealism and also Luis Buñuel with Katie Grant. She did this course on Luis Buñuel, and I got to see Los Olvidados, and I really liked that film. So then when I was finishing my undergraduate, I started sort of approaching filmmakers who work with non-professional actors to see if I could go and work with them and learn more about the processes and techniques. And I got a response from a director in Argentina called Carlos Sorin, who was positive, and he said, yes, you can come and work with me if you want. And so I went and worked with him on a couple of films, and he said, since your interest is on working with the non-professional actors, you'll be in charge of them sort of on screen, and your task will be to kind of take care of them essentially, on set and off set and stuff. So that's what I did on 2 films with him. So that was my job, to kind of work with him, try to get the best experience for them, and to help them get the performances Carlos needed, and so on. So I worked with him on those 2 films. We also made commercials together, and he worked with non-professionals on commercials as well, which was very, very interesting. And then when, I wanted to do a PhD in film. So when I was thinking about the topic, I thought, this could be a very interesting topic. And originally my plan, what I wanted to write about really was how digital filmmaking, which was blossoming at the time, sort of in the sort of 2010s, how sort of digital filmmaking was unlocking new possibilities for working with non-professional actors. Specifically, I was interested in sort of the possibility of rolling and shooting for extended periods of time, and sort of keeping on rolling essentially, and how that could be used to kind of get new types of performances. And I was interested in that. But when I started doing my literature review, and I was surprised to find that there wasn't a sort of, a sort of point, or like a book or like a text that had concentrated all existing work of non-professional actors that I could sort of build on. So I found that I had to start doing some of that work myself, because my whole argument was about how new films were kind of building on the classics and sort of developing some trends and so on. Also because my work with Carlos, he was often talking about Umberto D, and he was like, oh, I want this kind of thing like in Umberto D, or I want this kind of thing like in the other film. So he had those references. So I was interested in sort of showing that, but I found that I had to kind of explain that and sort of set it up in the book itself. So that was really the process, and how the kind of final shape of the book came to be. Um, I think it's a bit difficult for me to talk about, because with Catherine, we've been talking about the topic for several years now. So besides her book, which is fantastic, and I've gotten a lot from, I've also gotten a lot from talking to her. We've had like hundreds of conversations. We've gone to like conferences together. So there's a lot that I've learned from working with her, and it's been an absolute pleasure and a privilege. I think it's kind of a unique opportunity to have like a colleague that you get on well, who's working on the same topic at the same time as you. It's unique, you know what I mean? It's absolutely brilliant. Um, and but I would highlight specifically, I think, some of her insight onto some of those films, and onto some of the people, like her writing on Lamberto Maggiorani, I think is, amazing, because he is such an iconic figure, that has been talked about, but the way she kind of synthesizes his story and casts a new light upon him, I think it's fantastic. But also she introduced me to a lot of great films, like the classics as well, like seeing them in a new light, or seeing bits from the classics in a new light, like Paisan, and Carmela in Paisan. Like I hadn't really paid attention to her much before I spoke with Catherine, and we talked, and I read her work and so on. And also newer films as well, like Selfie and stuff, like yeah how her he showed me new ways of seeing these films and seeing these performances, and for me that's fantastic.
Great, thank you. So yeah, one of the implications I think of both of your books, and is that this term non-professional is less than satisfactory and frustrating, and we would like to be able to find ways, either find a new name for them, these actors, or at least to think of them more in terms of people with agency, and who are collaborators of some kind. And I think that film culture has certainly come a long way from the Bazinian idea of a one time only. One after one time, the non-professional actor is somehow spoiled, which is an idea that Robert Bresson also shared. And it kind of was very dismissive, and I think added to the invisibility of these performers in film history. More recently, we have Sean Baker, who refers to his untrained film performers as first timers, and some filmmakers have come to recognize their responsibility towards those who work anchors their films. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit about what you see as the future of non-professional performance, whether and how you think it might continue to evolve in practice and theory in new technologies, which I think Miguel, you already touched on a little bit, and also as issues of labor come more to the forefront of cinema studies and film studies more generally. If you've had any thoughts about where this study could go and where the practice could go or is going. Uh, Catherine?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. I mean, yeah, absolutely. There has been certainly in film studies more attention, and I guess, yeah, generally in the film industry, more broadly, more attention to these questions of labor and precarity and, treatment on set and all of these kind of things. And there have been lots of great works in film studies, kind of addressing these kind of histories of and contemporary questions of actors as workers. I think for me, one of the key questions is that often these actors, non-actors, tend not to be unionized, right? Because of just the very nature of how they're recruited. So these protections are generally not extended to them in their first appearance, right? And obviously they don't have other protections like an agent or a manager. So I think even in the contemporary context, it's kind of difficult to be sort of certain that things are actually improving, or that, there is going to be some kind of radical change. I mean, there are certain things, yes, that I think more directors are realizing their own responsibility, to especially when it's kind of vulnerable or marginalized people that they've kind of taken. I mean, a good example is the Garone film Io Capitano, which premiered at Venice in 2023 and kind of got a lot of success, Oscar nomination, etc., where he found these two boys in Senegal, and they then became the protagonists of the film, and one of them won one of the acting prizes at Venice. And he is now kind of sponsoring them to get like citizenship papers in Italy, and they're living with his mother, I believe, outside Rome. So that's a kind of really interesting case because it kind of, I think, points to this sort of extent of the involvement that the director might have to have in order to, I mean, that's, maybe a case that is a little unusual because it involves these questions of citizenship and, they're in a different country and they want to stay there. But I think it does point to these questions of, where does the responsibility of the production end? And certainly in the post-war period, it generally ended pretty much as soon as as soon as the last take was shot. But I think, yeah, and there are lots of cases also of directors who are very careful to say that, yeah, they are co-creating with actors, especially young ones. There was a bit of a kind of kerfuffle around Celine Sciamma's Girlhood a few years ago because that was felt to be like kind of a bit exploitative, that she'd just gone and kind of got these black French girls, and kind of put them on screen. And so following that, there have been some female directors, who have talked quite a lot about, oh, actually, we do all this workshopping and we have this very nurturing approach and we spent months together and all of this kind of stuff. So I think people, yeah, are more keen to show that it's not just a kind of, sort of one and done kind of thing. But I think in terms of the kind of futurity of the non-actor, that still just raises so many questions because the acting profession is by definition incredibly precarious, even for people who are highly trained and experienced. And so I think that sort of where are they now narrative is still kind of quite, sort of quite prominent. And I think certainly, a lot of the cases I looked at in the book, in the final chapter on sort of contemporary art house cinema, they're often, people from some kind of marginalized background, right? Because this kind of global realism, which aims to show suffering and, oppression, etc. And so I think my conclusion after all of this is that cinema just cannot save, that this idea that you still see kind of circulating of, that cinema can save somebody from, this kind of poverty or, uh, is probably very misguided. There's going to be the odd case of somebody who kind of makes it into kind of stable employment or has their life transformed in a positive way. But in other cases, it can actually endanger people to be taken from their kind of home environment. It can expose them to a lot of unwanted attention. So I think I feel kind of quite ambivalent about, sort of where this would go in terms of kind of questions of labor and the insertion of the non-professional into the industry, and also recognizing that quite a few people are quite happy not to continue. So these questions of sort of failure or success are not necessarily always applicable.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Miguel.
So yeah, I also think that's a great question. I think it's probably the question that I've thought about the most, over the past since I finished the book is, what happens next for the figure of the non-professional. And I think personally, I don't have a sort of very clear question, a clear answer yet. But when I was writing the book, and I think that's kind of between 2016 and 2020, that's when I was sort of writing most of the book. I did feel, and I wrote in the introduction of the book, I say something which I've been called upon already, like that, we were in a kind of golden age of our new golden age of non-professional actors. And it did feel that way to me, and the films I was watching and, like Albert Serra or Lisandro Alonso and all the sort of new, the slow cinema, it did feel to me that it was working with non-professional actors in ways that were new, but also very heavily informed by sort of the neo-realism and the sort of, Bazinian realism legacy in different ways, right? So it did feel to me like it was kind of building of that. And, I do definitely think that that's still continuing in some cases, and you have some very strong filmmakers working in those traditions, like Io Capitano, for example, by Garrone, I think, or for example, Oliver Lax's O Que Arde was, I think, on that line, or the films like Alcarrás by Carla Simón, which won at Berlin, I think last year or 2 years ago, was very much in that tradition, a bit like Tree of Wooden Clocks by Hermano Olmi and stuff, and it was building on that sort of neo-realist tradition. Having said that, and sort of building a little bit on what you were saying, Katie, about the kind of one-time non-professional that Bazin kind of celebrated and that Bresson also sort of embraced. I think in the mythology of the non-professional actor, sort of in the traditional mythology of the non-professional actor, there was that idea that, that sort of ethnographic idea that it was somebody who had never seen themselves on screen, that had a kind of level of an awareness of their own performance, right? That, was also, I think, building on ideas of authenticity that were sort of popular at the time, or that, have been iconic, like, what Michael Fried calls absorption, right? This idea of somebody who's, not aware of what's going on in different ways, right? And I think that was a kind of one of the elements that was mobilized in those performances, or that it was building on, right? Or that the idea was to kind of create that illusion or that effect of somebody who was sort of unaware of how they were coming across, and and I do wonder, I am interested in the way in which nowadays social media seems to have gravitated so powerfully towards the production and circulation of performances, right? And all these platforms are now focused on the exchanges of gestures, essentially, and the exchanges of screen performances. And I know that we have a unit in my department on social media, and we ask the students, how often, how long do you spend on social media every day? and the average was over 2 hours, right? And, I know that, not everybody who's on social media is producing performances. And I also know that, producing performances for social media is not the same as acting in films. But at the same time, it is, this sort of awareness of one's own gestures and awareness of one's own bodies by shooting oneself and watching oneself and, editing those, and thinking critically about that. It's an element of labor that's going on and that has skyrocketed, I feel, over the, it's one of the areas in which the general population or much of the general population has gained a lot of knowledge and is learning more about, I feel. And that makes me wonder to what extent, right, the traditional concept of the non-professional actor is still, will still perdure, or whether there will be new forms of performance or new forms of authenticity that are perhaps more accessible, right, and that are built on other qualities and not necessarily on absorption, but other forms. I think one film that I watched recently, I don't know if you've seen it, called The Human Surge by Eduardo Williams. It's a film I watched recently, and that to me, I thought was very, very interesting in terms of performance, because it was all with non-professional actors, and it has these very, very long takes, but the takes feel improvised, and what they're talking about and the dialogues have a sort of casualness, but at the same time, they're too well written to having been. And that when I watched it, I had a bit of a feeling of thinking, okay, this feels like a type of non-professional performance that to me does not kind of quite clearly continue the Bazinian legacy. It's a kind of new style of non-professional performance that is not so much based on absorption and so on. But yeah, sorry if that was a kind of rambly answer, but that's kind of how I'm feeling, I think.
No, thanks so much. In fact, I mean, it made me also think of Pacifaction with the Albert Serra's film that also has a non-professional performer who's extremely performative. Anyway, thank you so much. I think we could open it up now to the audience for questions. I guess you can just use your the raised hand icon if you can think if there's something you want to ask of the two authors. As I said, maybe some people have read the books, or maybe you want to know more about the books, or maybe you have your own um, question about non-professional performativity and performance.
Thanks, Katie. Can I jump in as host here? And I would like to make a suggestion to our attendees here, where our past events, one of the forms that we've taken during the Q&As is to encourage people to write out their questions in the chat. And because we're kind of compressed for time, it tends to help people kind of formulate their thoughts into a concise query. If you'd like to take advantage of that suggestion, please feel free to do so, and we'll ensure that we're keeping track of the chat questions, and we will pass the mic, as it were, over to the person who has formulated a question in order. But again, you're free to also voice that question yourself. Just a thought. Back to Katie.
Thanks, Aaron. Great idea. Chat questions, oral questions, we're open to everything. Aaron has a question.
I can get the ball rolling as people are formulating their thoughts. Could the authors speak about celebrity non-professional actors? It seems to me that a lot of the attention, interestingly, on this type of performance tends towards ordinary folks, or indeed sort of working class folks, or sort of folks from marginalized kind of positions. I wonder if either of the authors kind of considered the notion of performers from or figures from other walks of life who are not at all trained in dramatic forms of representation, who migrate their way into fiction film context. Catherine and Miguel, I don't know. I must confess I've not yet had the time to read your extraordinary looking books, but I just wondered if you had any preliminary thoughts on this notion of the professional non-professional, as it were.
Yeah, I've got a little bit in my final chapter about kind of crossover stars. So there has, already there's been kind of work on that in the past on, figures like Elvis and kind of mainly musical stars who moved into acting, and, some obviously with more success than others. And that, we have other figures who come in from other parts of the world of entertainment, athletes, sports people, etc. The Rock is a massive star, who kind of started off as a, non-professional. And I think though they're kind of interesting figures because they, again, and this is why I find the non-professional so intriguing because it always kind of brings up these questions of, well, what do we mean by a non-professional actor, right? When you have someone who maybe has come from the world of performance, but in a different, you have a singer, someone like Lady Gaga, who kind of moves across, and that's kind of seen as fine. Because they're bringing other kind of performative skills, right, as well as a kind of persona, so they don't feel maybe non-professional because audiences, are so familiar with them. And of course, that was one of the key. So if we go back to neorealism, that was one of the key sort of principles of someone like Cesare Zavattini, that it's the non-professional is so important because it's the audience doesn't feel intimidated or inferior by the kind of star persona, right? That we are on the same plane as some ordinary person, right? Which is obviously not the case with The Rock or Lady Gaga, because we're already dealing with their star persona. And even in the 40s, there were a lot of 30s and 40s in Italy, there were a lot of debates about this because they brought in all sorts of people to kind of become actors who were not trained. So there were quite a lot of sports people who kind of, acted in films in Italy, but not in the kind of classic kind of neorealist style. And I think they always, I mean, one of the things, one of the questions the non-professional always raises is like, what is about sort of good and bad acting, or certain maybe value judgments we attach to that, or an effective authenticity, which we can see as either good or bad, depending on on the context. So I think that question kind of gets more, there's maybe more tolerance for like an ordinary person who finds themselves, kind of cast in a film, right? And maybe isn't quite at the, level of some of the, if they're surrounded by professionals. But when I think when a professional performer is kind of brought into that and they flop, it's like a massive flop. We think of Harry Styles in Don't Worry, Darling, right? And that was like this kind of, right, that's it, for him in his acting career. How dare he think, that he could kind of infiltrate the ranks of the professionally trained, So I think there are different levels of audience kind of tolerance for these figures based on the kind of expectation level, and also the kind of idea that, okay, well, as with some of the neorealist films, the acting maybe isn't very good, in terms of what we might kind of think of as kind of technical acting. But we bask in, a certain kind of, as Miguel says, kind of non-professional effect of, knowing generally, because the publicity will have told us that this person is not trained or has been plucked from the streets of, insert place here. So yeah, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Miguel.
Um, yeah, I mean, on that question of the effect and what Catherine was just talking about in terms of neorealism, I think it's also useful to remember that the neorealist performances were dubbed, by professional actors in many cases. So what you're seeing on screen is the body of a first timer, but the voice is that of someone who's very, very professional, right? So the resulting performance is very much a kind of mixture there. So I think that's interesting, and also in terms of performance, the idea of the professional non-professional, or the professional non-actor, the less use the concept to refer to sort of people like Jean-Pierre Léaud and Monica Vitti, and that sort of like modernist cinema actors who he says were kind of sort of drifting, and they didn't, they would go on to rambling conversations, and that seemed to be kind of aimless and purposeless. And I think he was kind of drawing a connection there between those sort of modes of performance and perhaps some of the neo-realist performances. I do have a chapter in my book about about Honor Swinton Barnes, sorry, who's the daughter of Tilda Swinton, and she acts in a film called The Souvenir by Joanna Hogg, which I found quite an interesting case because she wasn't technically a celebrity in the sense that she wasn't a kind of iconic face before she made the film, and I think she's still not now like a kind of very famous person, but she is obviously the daughter of a very, very famous actor. So the question is there, like, to what extent can somebody like that be regarded or considered as a non-professional actor, right? Where she's probably been on set more than, like many professional actors, right? And, she has, all the connections and the background and so on.
The Nepo non-professional.
Yeah, yeah, exactly, exactly. But I thought that was an interesting film because I think it was kind of thematizing some of those questions, right? About, the questions of, can you be, how vulnerable can you be when you have this kind of privilege and so on. So I thought it was kind of used interestingly and well. I think there's also an interesting point to mention with regards to what you were saying, Aaron, and in terms of performance. And this is something that Cynthia and I were discussing a couple of months ago, which was the idea of like, the idea that I think for some of the neo-realists and so on, like to play the working class as a professional, there was something wrong about that to a certain degree after neo-realism, right? The idea is that you had I don't know it had to look like you weren't trying to play a poor person, and that's I think Pasolini said that he found it intolerable, right, when a professional actor played a working class character. So I think there was kind of something there as well in the way in which non-professional actors were used and became a trend or became a tradition, and that's why I think when we talk about non-professional actors or we think about non-professional actors, we tend to think about certain kind of films or certain kind of characters. Even as you say very well, if you think about the concept in a kind of more distance and objective way, it kind of applies to a lot of people that don't immediately come to mind, right? But yeah.
Great, thank you. Cynthia, do you want to ask your question yourself that's in the chat? Or do you want me to read it?
Yeah, I mean, I just, I mainly, thank you for your remarkable work. Reading, particularly the openings where you have to lay things out, map things out. It kind of makes my head explode. I've read the opening chapters of both of your books many times, and I'm still missing things. So I don't know how you did it. It's really amazing. At any rate, yeah, these are just really small questions. You were just talking about the human surge, Miguel, and I'm like, kind of reminds me of Slacker. And that, anyway, I just, it's all that mode has been around. I don't know. I haven't seen the human surge. So anyway, and also, yeah, Catherine, I was ashamed that I didn't know about all the material that you were referencing, so you've given me a lot of homework, and thank you. Anyway, that's thank you.
Catherine, do you want to talk a
Yeah,
little bit about
the scholar that was really hard because, as you said, it is very disparate. There has been like a lot of kind of fragmentary contributions over the year, going right back to the 20s, and Pudovkin and all, obviously some of the kind of, classic kind of theorists. But I find it very challenging. Also because I put pen to paper, or rather started typing the first chapter of the book in February 2020. So literally like a month before lockdown. And so I had no idea then that actually, like, for 2 years, like, I couldn't go anywhere. I couldn't go to libraries. So I had to just do a lot of online kind of research, and people were also very kind in sending me things. What was very helpful for me in the Italian context was getting access to a whole kind of set of runs of some of the trade press, which had been digitized by colleagues in Italy for another project, and they very kindly allowed some of us to look at them. So that was amazing because you were getting the kind of trade press discussion about non-professionals, which gave a really important insight, which generally hadn't been represented, right? It was always the critics kind of, critiquing performances or whatever. So, and then when finally I was able to go to Italy, I was able to go to the State Archive and look at some of the cinema files where you were able to find things like how much people got paid and, contracts for some of the films, which was really, really helpful. But yeah, just in terms of the kind of massive body of work, yeah, it's both sort of was, kind of voluminous, but then there are so many gaps still, especially around individual performers, kind of going back a little bit, so certain films have been like worked over to death, like Bicycle Thieves, but even then, there's still a lot of gaps about what happened to some of the people. And so there were just so many trails that were like a total dead end. There were so many people that I never found out. I was going to write an article at one point called 404 Not Found, because that was like constantly what you get. You go onto Wikipedia about a film and then you try and click on a link of one of the actors. There's just nothing. So it's little scraps of newspaper references or things like that. And I say this in the conclusion, I think, because I sort of talk a bit more about like kind of using a speculative method and kind of what do you do when the sources just kind of aren't there, and so you're kind of having to make certain assumptions about someone's kind of involvement in a film, which is maybe kind of not very satisfactory, but yeah, there's absolutely kind of nothing else there.
Thanks. I don't know, Miguel, do you have anything to add about your research methods?
Well, I think it's the way in which the literature is scattered, I think, is one of the greatest challenges. And I think that there is a book on that came out in German, I think a few years, like 3 or 4 years ago, by Anna Louise Kiss. And that's a kind of, review, like a critical review of the literature of non-professional actors. It's only in German, I think, at the moment, but if any of you speaks German and wants to read it, should be interesting. And Anna Louise Kies also wrote an interesting article on comparing non-professional, the work with non-professional actors in La Terra Trema by Visconti and the films of Straub Huyet. So that's also, that is in English, if you're interested in. But yeah, I thought I'd mention it because yeah, it could be an interesting. But yeah, it's the fact that it is so scattered, and I think that to a certain extent it also has to do with the fact that the idea of the non-professional sort of really dates back to the sort of history and the prehistory of cinema and film criticism. It's something that has been discussed on and off for a long time. A bit like some of those old concepts like photogeny and so on that also have a kind of esotericism. So it's also hard to distinguish what is serious from not, and you know what I mean. And it has that sort of legacy. So yeah, I think one of the challenge was sort of trying to not only find the sources and like collect the data, but also set it up in a sort of conversation, right? Set it up in a way that kind of made sense. But yeah.
Great. Thank you. I mean, I think we really have only time for one more question. And Eduardo, I think, posted a comment earlier in the chat, and I don't know if you want to add to that, or in terms of your experience with Brazilian cinema. So Eduardo.
Hello,
Oh, there he
can you
is.
hear me?
Hi.
Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Hello.
Hi.
Oh,
Yeah, so you posted a question about the Brazilian cinema. Is there something you want to add to or ask Miguel or Catherine?
yeah. It's just a little comment, and I'm sorry for my English. I don't speak English very often, so I'm a little bit raw, but it's amazing to listen to you both. You are part of my PhD bibliography, so it's amazing to be here. and in non-professional Brazilian actors as well. It's in acting Brazilian cinema, and it's interesting to hear you both that because here in Brazil we have this like those two moments. One like in the end of the 90s, in the 2000s, where we take the non-professional actors and we make them became act like professionals. So we have like this only the publicity of movies says they are non-professionals, but they spend like 2-3 months, 1 year rehearsing with the non-professional to make them act like professionals. And City of God, perhaps it's a film that you guys know. It's like one very important film in this case. But a few years ago, we had this documentary, City of God, 10 years later, that shows that the non-professional actors, the black ones, mostly are back to the poverty and they have nothing. And the white ones they have, so like social issues in Brazil, very represented in those movies. And we have like from the last like 15 years from and now we have those new kind of Brazilian cinema that changes the relation with the non-professional actors and bring them like to become a big family kind of group of theater that repeat in the same filmography of same directors. So we have like those two moments in Brazilian cinema, and they are very linked to our politics, our culture politics of making movies in this century. Can you see as well like this ethical posture, changing of ethical posture in like other world cinemas? So you have like this use of the non-professional as a raw material, as like an object, and you have now this movement of considering the non-professional actor as an actor. In the end, the non-professional actor is an actor. So I think the aesthetical response of this is different, but in the set, I think he's an actor in the end. Can you see like this difference in the cinemas that you study of posture of the?
Sorry, yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. And those examples that you were mentioning of like City of God and earlier films, these kind of delinquent films, right, which is very much kind of about taking people from the street and often kind of younger people, and there's a kind of very sensationalizing aspect of it. And Charlotte Gleghorn has written a very good chapter on that. In the Brazilian context, right, and how the kind of autobiographical effect of that. And I think, I mean, I mentioned earlier, I think, yeah, there are changes in practice and ethics and more attention, but I think there are still certain genres, certainly in Italian cinema, where there is still this fascination, like with the delinquent child, right? We still get these films that come out, particularly of like Naples, Camorra, where those kind of films are still kind of being produced, really, which I think is kind of interesting and a bit problematic, where there kind of maybe seems to have in a certain genre not moved beyond that kind of idea of the street child as a kind of resource, to be kind of put on display for this international audience because we're fascinated by the mafia or whatever, Whereas in other genres, maybe, things are a little bit different. I mean, but that's just my sort of experience from Italy.
Thanks. Miguel, do you have anything to add?
Just very quickly, I mean, I think there's different contexts, but I think in terms of the sort of aesthetics and performance and stuff, I think probably an interesting case might be Pedro Costa in Portugal with his latest film, Vitalina Varela, and Horse Money before that, which they seem to continue his style in some ways, but they feel much more, much less, I guess, the performances that he's looking for and then they're producing together feel much more like professional in a way, right? And I was at a symposium with him not long ago, and he said that, whilst he used to sort of shoot for a long time and, record a lot of raw footage and so on, and kind of shoot the actors when they were acting and when they were not, and the rehearsals and so on, I think he was saying that now he's working in a much more, he's rehearsing, and then when they go for the take, they go for the take, and, everything is sort of much more sort of curated and prepared and so on. That could be an interesting case. And I think it also might be interesting to think about that transformation also as a way of creating forms of distinction, in the sense that, when everybody's like, he was such an influential figure and everybody many people try to kind of do what he was doing, and now he's doing something different. I think that's also interesting, right? And yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. I think we're out of time. Thank you, Catherine and Miguel, for sharing your work with us. And I encourage everybody to read the books if you're not impressed enough. And we'll see many of you, I hope, at SCMS in one way or another. And thank you, Aaron, again, and Amanda and Maggie for inviting us to do this. I think it was really interesting conversation.
Thank you, Katie, as well.
Thanks to our hosts for the most and our fabulous authors. Thanks everybody for attending today. Please try to fill out your surveys. There is a link to it in the chat at the beginning of the notes, as well as attend our next author event. There is a note in the chat about there as well too, where you can download and share the flyer. Otherwise, thank you very much, folks, and until next time, enjoy your weekend. Thanks again, everyone.
Thanks so
Thank
much,
you. Thank
authors.
you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.